What is up, everybody? Welcome back to another one. Check out roguemacro.substack.com. Post this morning, the collapse of international fiction and the illusion of parody. Let's get into it. Rogue Missive number 120. The post-war fiction. For 80 years, the world has lived inside of a story. The story says that nations are bound by international law, that borders are guaranteed by international institutions, and that disputes are settled according to rules and norms rather than power. In reality, nearly every international action during this era was built on U.S. troops, U.S. equipment, and U.S. funding, with a veneer of multilateralism slapped on top. So this idea that every country is the same, even if you have a tiny military, a tiny economy, all nations are equal in weight. That is this international fiction that we have had in the post-World War II era. The real question is, what happens when the United States grows tired of the veneer and wants a fresh start? Like a superhero who stops pretending to be normal. We are now getting a front row seat to the rest of the world discovering that international equality was always a fiction. There is no peer to the United States and never has been in the post-war era. Historical anomaly. The so-called rules-based order emerged after 1945 when most of the major international organizations, as we know them today, were created. Post-World War II organizations. You have the UN in 1945, UN specialized agencies here. We have the IMF, 1944, World Bank, 1944, ICAO, that's the International Civil Aviation Organization, so the rules of the sky, 1944, International Court of Justice, 1945, UNESCO, United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, 1945. FAO, that's the Food and Agriculture Organization, 1945. The WHO, the World Health Organization, 1948. IMO, International Maritime Organization, that has to do with, law, sea lane, the rules of the sea, sea lanes, 1948. WMO, World Meteorological Organization, 1950. Bretton Woods, 1944. General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or GATT, 1947. North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, 1949. And the European Coal and Steel Community, now the EU, was started in 1951. There are a few post-Cold War organizations, and that would be the European Union as a political union. So following on from 1951, it became the European Economic Community, I think, before maybe around 1960, and then the European Union in 1993, but it's just a follow-on organization here. World Trade Organization was in 1945. You can see that's post-Cold War. And the G8 and the G20 were 97 and 99, respectively. The world these institutions describe and attempt to govern is not the natural state of geopolitics. It is an anomaly created by a single, overwhelming dominant power that had both the capacity and the will to suppress traditional rivalries. It was in America's interest during the Cold War to contrast the Soviet system with a free world system. The U.S. could not and did not want to fight everywhere militarily to stop the spread of communism, but it could build a global architecture that incentivized cooperation, aligned allies, stabilized currencies, and made defection costly. This was a strategy that, for the time, paid for itself. However, these organizations never possessed real independent authority. They only appeared to because the United States was willing to stand behind them, fund them, and ultimately enforce the outcomes they produced. The Third World was courted through industrialization and aid. Mutually assured destruction created a world where direct great power war was impossible, so the competition moved into trade, influence, and proxy conflicts instead. The end of the Cold War and the progressive turn. With the end of the Cold War in 1991, the international order lost its central antagonist. For the first time since 1945, the system no longer existed to oppose something. Liberal values had won. The Soviet Union collapsed, and in that vacuum, a strange and profoundly destabilizing idea took hold, that history itself had ended. The end of history and other semi-utopian theories spread throughout academia, policy circles, and the media. If there was no longer a rival civilizational model, then perhaps politics itself could be replaced by administration and conflict replaced by management. Progress was no longer something to be defended against enemies. It was something to be engineered. A kind of progressive scientism crept into the culture. We had split the atom, landed on the moon, and mapped the genome. Star Trek and Star Wars had trained an entire generation to believe that the future was inevitably technological, cosmopolitan, and frictionless. We just needed to keep improving, optimizing, and advancing. This technical progressivism was matched on the social side by the explosion of critical theory and postmodernism, or what can be called cultural Marxism. These ideologies were not conservative or stabilizing. They were revolutionary in their own way. They argued that mankind could be perfected through critical consciousness, destruction of society, and endless social reengineering. History was no longer something to be inherited or endured, but something to be corrected. These progressive ideas were not new. They had been fermenting in the United States and the West more generally for generations. During the Cold War, progressive, quote unquote progressive, was specifically used as a euphemism for communist by the Communist Party, so they could more openly advocate in a society organized around anti-communism. With the Cold War guard let down after 1991, these ideas flourished in universities. The first generation raised entirely after the Cold War came of age roughly between 2010 and 2015, when woke exploded on the scene. As this ideologically formed generation entered the workforce, its influence spread into corporate culture, HR departments, media, and eventually state institutions themselves. What had once been a civilizational alliance organized against an external enemy slowly turned inward and began reorganizing itself around moral projects, identity categories, and ideological purification. For a long time, the West could afford this, but eventually the diminishing marginal returns of debt and financialization caught up. The Great Financial Crisis was the initial earthquake of the end of the post-World War II financial order. An unsecured system transitioned to a secured system. Cultural Marxism is also fundamentally hostile to profit, capital formation, and productive hierarchy, and so it began to slowly erode the economic engine from that angle as well. The story of the post-World War II rules-based order and free trade was gradually hijacked by ideologues who were at bottom hostile to the civilization that created it. At the very moment the West was taking the system for granted, the system was being hollowed out from within. Enough is enough. For 80 years, the international order was built on Western liberalism, international order and trade, but in reality, everything rested on the shoulders of the U.S. The system only worked because the U.S. was willing to underwrite it militarily, financially, and strategically. In doing so, America hollowed out much of its own manufacturing base, degraded its culture, and strained the social and psychological fabric of the nation. The progressive drive for universalism and abstraction overrode stability in the civilizational sense. International law has never existed independently of great power enforcement. That's the main key line here. Perhaps in the whole thing. The League of Nations had no hegemon behind it and failed dramatically. The British era of free trade depended entirely on the Royal Navy. The Westphalian system developed sovereign states, diplomacy, and laws of war, but it had no courts or global institutions. It was enforced by monarchs. World War I put an end to them, right? The post-World War II system was no different. An independent system of international law never existed apart from American power and American willingness to enforce outcomes. Any great power that underwrites a system must be willing to subordinate its own immediate interests to it. Over time, that subordination became ideological. Okay, and also in this part, I should have added in here. So any great power that underwrites a system must be willing to subordinate its own immediate interests to it. And that's fine as long as there is no rival, okay? But as countries mature under this system and they learn how to undermine it instead of underwrite it, then the great hegemon, the great power that is underwriting the system, feels an existential threat. Over time, that subordination became ideological. With the end of history and the spread of progressivism came destructive ideas. A world without borders, a world of global citizens, and a moral framework that increasingly challenged the legitimacy of nation states and sovereign peoples themselves. There is an old saying, democracy is two wolves and a sheep voting on what's for dinner. Another is that democracy eventually breaks down when the majority discovers it can vote itself the wealth of the minority. This is the tragedy of the commons, and it is what ultimately hollowed out the post-war order from within. The progressive framework contains deep contradictions. We are told we are all equal global citizens, yet the pursuit of equity, where non-Western populations are systemically favored economically and morally, is treated as the highest good. Within this moral logic, rich countries are encouraged to enforce their own dissolution. They are not supposed to enforce borders or meaningfully defend citizenship. They are simply expected to let the wolves in. That phase is over. Greenland exposes this radical mental shift. The United States is now pulling the mask back. The entire concept of international law depends on enforcement. And for 80 years, that enforcement has been the United States. The America First era is simply America saying, no, we will enforce our interests. You are free to attempt to enforce yours. This shift is being revealed in real time in the Greenland debate. When Trump said that landing boats on Greenland 500 years ago does not give Denmark a meaningful claim to it, Europeans rushed to reply, your claim to your own land comes from boats 500 years ago too. But that response misses the point entirely. America First logic returns the world to the way it always actually worked. The post-war period only covered this reality with polite language and legal fictions. In the real world, might makes right. The United States has a claim to its land because it can defend it. Denmark does not have a real claim to Greenland because it cannot. That is not a moral statement. It is a factual one. Denmark's claim exists only by the goodwill of the United States, period. The United States has no peer nation. Russia has proven itself militarily and economically weak with its performance in Ukraine. China is a communist system and not a true expeditionary or global force projection power. Their modern military equipment, once thought to rival the US's systems, has been shown to be completely ineffective in Iran, Pakistan, and now Venezuela. There is no country on earth that can enforce anything on the United States. Therefore, the US can do what it believes to be in its own interest. The only real check on power of this nature is a global coalition against it. If America were to turn truly predatory, such a coalition would be easy to form. If it remains broadly good, such a coalition is impossible. When Trump said the other day, the only limit on my power is my morality, he was not boasting. He was stating a structural fact about the world as it actually exists. This is the second American century. You should get used to it. All right, guys, check out roguemacro.substack.com. Appreciate everybody subscribing, supporting my work. More of this to come, and I will see you guys on the next one. Bye.